The chandeliers above the grand ballroom of the Kensington estate dripped with crystal tears, each one worth more than most people earned in a year. Andrew Whitmore stood beneath them, feeling like he was drowning in light. "Chin up, darling," his mother hissed through her practiced smile, her fingers digging into his arm with the pressure of a vice wrapped in Chanel No. 5. "The Duchess of Harrington is watching, and you're slouching like a common tradesman." Andrew straightened instinctively, years of etiquette training overriding his desire to shrug her off. Around him, the elite of British society swirled in their evening gowns and tailored tuxedos, a sea of inherited wealth and centuries-old surnames that looked at him and his family like wolves circling fresh meat that had wandered into their territory. "The problem, Andrew," his father said, appearing at his other side with 2 glasses of champagne that probably cost more than the average monthly rent, "is that you don't seem to understand what's at stake here. We've worked too hard to build this fortune, only to have you dilute the bloodline with some unsuitable match." Andrew took the champagne but didn't drink. The word bloodline always made his skin crawl as if they were breeding racehorses rather than discussing his future marriage. In a way, he supposed, they were. "Your mother and I have been quite strategic," his father continued, nodding toward a cluster of young women across the room, each one draped in family jewels and the confidence of knowing their great-great-grandfathers had titles when Andrews had been working in coal mines. "Lady Charlotte Pemberton, her family traces back to the Plantagenets. Miss Arabella Sinclair Hayes, her grandmother was a countess. And of course there's Princess Katerina of Liechtenstein, who I'm told is quite amenable to the right financial arrangement." The word hung in the air between them like a transaction, which, Andrew supposed, was exactly what his parents envisioned. His millions, earned through tech investments and venture capital that his parents barely understood, were new money, shiny and vulgar in the eyes of the aristocracy. But money could buy many things, including access to the world his parents desperately wanted to climb into. "She's willing to overlook your origins," his mother added delicately, which was her way of saying that his grandfather had made the fortune in shipping containers, not shipping routes in the spice trade. "All it would take is a generous settlement and your commitment to restoring her family's estate in Bavaria. Think of it, Andrew, you could be married to royalty. Our grandchildren could have titles." Andrew's grip tightened on the champagne flute. "I'm 28, not a dynasty waiting to happen." "You're 28 with £200 million and no direction," his father corrected sharply. "Do you know how many men would kill for the opportunity you're squandering? You could have a title, Andrew, real standing, not this nouveau riche purgatory we're stuck in." And there it was, the truth that underscored every gala, every introduction, every carefully orchestrated encounter with eligible daughters of the peerage. His parents had made their fortune, but they hadn't made their name. They were rich, but they weren't them. They could buy their way into these ballrooms, but they'd never truly belong. Unless Andrew married up. Unless he became the bridge between their money and the aristocracy's bloodlines. "The princess is expecting you to ask her to dance. This is unacceptable, Andrew," his mother said, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that meant non-compliance wasn't an option. "Don't embarrass us, darling, and for God's sake, don't mention anything about technology or investments. Women of her caliber find that sort of thing terribly common." Andrew looked across the room at Princess Katerina, who was indeed beautiful in the way of a porcelain doll, perfect, cold, and utterly untouchable. She was surrounded by a coterie of equally perfect women, all of them laughing at something someone had said, the sound tinkling like the chandeliers above them. Artificial, rehearsed, empty. "I need some air," Andrew said, setting down his champagne untouched. "Andrew!" his mother started, but he was already moving, weaving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent his whole life at events like this, smiling politely, making small talk, slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations he'd never asked to carry. He made it to the French doors that led to the terrace, then past the terrace to the gardens, then through a service entrance he'd discovered at these events years ago when he'd first started needing escape routes from his own life. Within minutes, he was in his Aston Martin, tie already loosened, driving through the London streets with no destination in mind, just the desperate need to be anywhere but there. The city lights blurred past his windows as he drove, the contrast between the glittering West End and the quieter neighborhoods growing more pronounced with each mile. He ended up in Camden, parking in an all-night diner that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1950s America and stubbornly refused to acknowledge that decades had passed. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh after the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers, and the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee replaced expensive perfume and champagne. Andrew slid into a corner booth, his tuxedo drawing curious glances from the handful of late-night customers, shift workers, insomniacs, and people who, like him, were running from something. "Rough night?" the waitress asked, appearing with a pot of coffee and a knowing smile. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and the comfortable demeanor of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. "You could say that," Andrew replied, grateful when she poured him a cup without asking. "Woman trouble?" "Family trouble disguised as woman trouble," he said, surprised by his own honesty. She nodded sagely. "That's usually how it goes. The people who love us think they know what's best for us, forgetting that we might know ourselves a bit better." Andrew wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. When was the last time someone had spoken to him like this? Like a person, not a bank balance or a stepping stone to a title. "What if what they want for you isn't what you want for yourself?" he asked. The waitress shrugged, topping off his coffee. "Then you've got yourself a choice to make, don't you? But here's the thing I've learned in 63 years on this earth. You can live someone else's dream, but you'll spend every night sleeping in someone else's bed, if you catch my meaning. Metaphorically speaking, of course." She winked and moved on to check on the other customers, leaving Andrew alone with his coffee and his thoughts. Through the diner's window, he could see his car parked on the street, the Aston Martin worth more than everything in this diner combined. It was a symbol of everything he had and everything he was expected to be. But sitting here in his rumpled tuxedo in a Camden diner at 2 in the morning, Andrew felt more like himself than he had in months, maybe years. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Where did you go? The princess is asking for you. This is unacceptable, Andrew." He turned the phone face down on the table and ordered pie. Andrew started going to Camden regularly after that night, always finding excuses to drive through the neighborhood, to walk its eclectic streets where vintage shops sat next to record stores, and no one cared if your family could trace its lineage back to the Norman Conquest. It was on one of these aimless wanderings, 3 weeks after the disastrous gala, that he found the bookshop. It was tucked between a tattoo parlor and a vintage clothing store, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The sign above the door read, "Between the Lines," in hand-painted letters that were slightly crooked, as if the person who'd painted them had prioritized charm over precision. The window display was an organized chaos of books stacked in precarious towers, interspersed with potted plants and what appeared to be handwritten recommendation cards. Andrew pushed open the door, and a bell chimed overhead, the sound bright and welcoming. The shop was small, crammed floor to ceiling with books that seemed to follow no particular organizational system. Fiction bled into philosophy, poetry nestled against true crime, and everything smelled like paper and possibility. "I'll be with you in just a moment," a voice called from somewhere in the back, followed by a crash and a very colorful curse. Andrew smiled despite himself, wandering toward the voice. He found her in the poetry section, surrounded by fallen books and glaring at a top shelf as if it had personally offended her. "Stupid, ridiculously tall shelves," she muttered, her dark curls escaping from a haphazard bun. "Who designs a bookshop where the owner can't reach the top shelf?" "Need some help?" Andrew offered. She turned, and Andrew felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't beautiful in the carefully cultivated way of the women at his mother's galas. She was beautiful in the way of real things, messy and vibrant, and entirely herself. Her eyes were bright with frustration, and there was a smudge of dust on her cheek. "Unless you're 7 feet tall, I don't see how you could help," she said, then seemed to actually look at him for the first time. Her gaze traveled from his face down to his shoes, handmade Italian leather that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and back up again. "Although I suppose those fancy shoes might give you an extra inch." Andrew looked down at his Berlutis, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm 6'2", will that do?" "It'll have to." She gestured at the shelf. "I need the Neruda anthology, the red one with the gold lettering." Andrew reached up easily, retrieving the book and handing it to her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and he felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the way she smiled when she looked at the book. "Perfect," she said, hugging it to her chest. "I've had a customer asking for this all week, and of course I put it on the one shelf I can't reach. I'm Beatrice, by the way. Welcome to Between the Lines." "Andy," he said, the diminutive coming out before he could think about it. Andrew was the name his parents used, the name on his business cards and in Forbes articles. Andy felt lighter. "I'm just browsing." "Best way to find the books you didn't know you needed," Beatrice said, already moving toward the front of the shop, the Neruda anthology still clutched in her hands. "Fair warning, I'm very pushy with recommendations. If you look even remotely interested in something, I will find 12 other books you absolutely must read." Andrew followed her, charmed despite himself. "That sounds more like a feature than a bug." "Tell that to my customers' budgets," she replied, ringing up the Neruda for what I assumed was the waiting customer, though no one else was in the shop. "Are you local? I don't think I've seen you around here before." "I live in Kensington," Andrew said, then quickly added, "but I like it better here. More character." Beatrice snorted, a wholly undignified sound that he found utterly delightful. "Character is estate agent speak for the building is falling apart and the plumbing is questionable. But yes, Camden has soul. You can't buy that, even in Kensington." If only she knew how much his parents had spent trying to buy exactly that, soul, authenticity, the kind of history and standing that no amount of money could truly purchase. "What kind of books do you like?" Beatrice asked, leaning against the counter in a way that suggested she had all the time in the world for this conversation. Andrew thought about the leather-bound first editions in his apartment, carefully curated by an interior designer to look impressive, and mostly unread. "I'm not sure anymore. I used to read a lot when I was younger, science fiction mostly, Philip K. Dick, Asimov, Ursula Le Guin." Beatrice's face lit up. "Le Guin! The Left Hand of Darkness changed my life when I was 17. Have you read The Dispossessed?" "Not yet," Andrew admitted. "Criminal," Beatrice declared, already moving through the shop with the confidence of someone who knew every book's location by heart. "Absolutely criminal. It's about a physicist from an anarchist moon colony who travels to the capitalist planet below, and the whole thing is this beautiful meditation on belonging and alienation and what home really means." She pulled a worn paperback from a shelf and pressed it into Andrew's hands. "Read this, then come back and tell me what you think." Andrew looked at the book, its cover creased and spine cracked from multiple readings. "What if I don't like it?" "Then you have terrible taste, and I'll have to re-educate you with my entire science fiction collection," Beatrice said cheerfully. "But you'll like it, I can tell." You can tell from one conversation that I'll like a specific book. I've been doing this for 5 years. You develop a sense for these things. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and seen. You're looking for something, Andy. I don't know what, but people who wander into obscure bookshops in Camden on a Tuesday afternoon are always looking for something. Sometimes it's a book. Sometimes it's themselves. The observation was so acute, so uncomfortably accurate, that Andrew didn't know what to say. He looked down at the Ursula Le Guin novel, its pages soft with age and handling. How much? £8, Beatrice said, returning to the counter. Andrew pulled out his wallet and handed her a 20, waving away the change. Keep it. Think of it as a down payment on that re-education you mentioned. Beatrice raised an eyebrow but pocketed the money. Big tipper. Either you're very generous or very guilty about something. Can't it be both? She laughed, and the sound filled the small shop like light through a window. It was loud and unrestrained and entirely genuine, so different from the practiced titters he'd heard at the gala. This was real laughter, the kind that came from joy rather than politeness. I like you, Andy from Kensington. You can come back even if you hate the book. I won't hate it, Andrew said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. He left the shop with the book tucked under his arm and a strange lightness in his chest, as if he'd set down a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying. Behind him, he could hear Beatrice singing off-key to whatever was playing on the shop's ancient radio, and he smiled all the way back to his car. His phone had 17 missed calls from his mother. He didn't call her back. Andrew returned to Between the Lines 3 days later, having devoured The Dispossessed in late-night reading sessions that pushed back his carefully maintained sleep schedule. He found Beatrice wrestling with a box of new arrivals, her face flushed with effort. The physicist finds home in the journey, not the destination, Andrew announced by way of greeting. Beatrice looked up, a grin spreading across her face. You finished it, and you understood. I'm officially impressed, Andy from Kensington. I told you I'd like it, he said, setting down his coffee. He'd learned to stop by the cafe next door first, and reaching for the box she was struggling with. Here, let me. My hero, Beatrice said dryly, but she stepped back and let him lift the box onto the counter. They're getting heavier, I swear, or I'm getting weaker. Either way, it's deeply unfair. Andrew opened the box, revealing stacks of pristine new releases. Business must be good if you're ordering this many. Business is existing, Beatrice said with a shrug. I'm not getting rich, but I'm keeping the lights on and doing what I love, which is more than most people can say. She pulled out a novel with a striking cover, examining it critically. This is the new Margaret Atwood. Have you read her? The Handmaid's Tale in university, Andrew said. Required reading for a literature elective I took. And did you think it was prophetic or paranoid? Both, Andrew said honestly. Is that allowed? In my bookshop, everything is allowed, except dog-earing pages and breaking spines, Beatrice said firmly. Well, that and fascism, but that goes without saying. Andrew helped her unpack the box, falling into an easy rhythm as Beatrice sorted the books and he shelved them according to her rapid-fire directions. It felt good to work with his hands, to do something concrete and useful rather than attending another meeting or reviewing another investment portfolio. So what do you actually do, Andy? Beatrice asked as she handed him a stack of mysteries. You said you're a consultant, but that could mean anything from I help businesses to I'm a hitman with a euphemistic job title. Andrew paused, a Robert Galbraith novel in his hand. The lie he told on that first day, that he was a struggling consultant, sat uncomfortably in his throat. But the truth felt impossible. How could he explain that he was worth £200 million, that his parents were trying to marry him off to royalty, that every aspect of his life was a performance for an audience he'd never chosen? Business consulting, he said vaguely, helping companies optimize their operations, that sort of thing. Sounds thrilling, Beatrice said, her tone suggesting it sounded anything but. Is it your passion? No one had ever asked him that. They asked if it was profitable, if it was prestigious, if it would lead to the right connections. But passion? No, he admitted. It pays the bills, though. So does literally any job, Beatrice countered. Life's too short to spend it doing something that doesn't set your soul on fire, Andy. Trust me, I could be making 3 times what I make here if I'd stuck with my marketing job at that soulless corporation in Canary Wharf. But I'd also be 3 times as miserable. You worked in corporate marketing? Andrew asked, surprised. For about 2 years after university, made good money, hated every second of it. Then my grandmother died and left me just enough to buy this place, and I thought, what's the worst that could happen? Turns out, the worst that can happen is a lot, including a burst pipe last winter that destroyed about 30 books, but at least I'm happy while the universe conspires against me. Andrew laughed, shelving the last of the mysteries. That's a remarkably optimistic way of looking at disaster. Optimistic or delusional, the line is very thin. Beatrice collapsed into the worn armchair behind the counter, gesturing for Andrew to take the stool across from her. Okay, real talk. Why are you really here? And don't say browsing, because you've been here twice in 3 days and you've only bought 1 book. Maybe I'm a very slow reader. You finished a dense philosophical science fiction novel in 3 days. Try again. Andrew found himself smiling despite being caught out. Maybe I like the company. Beatrice's expression softened slightly, something vulnerable flickering across her features before her usual cheerful armor slid back into place. Flattery will get you everywhere, Andy, or at least a discount on your next purchase. I'll take it, he said, and meant it. They talked for hours that day, the conversation wandering from books to music to Beatrice's theory that all romantic comedies were secretly horror movies from the perspective of everyone who wasn't the main couple. Andrew found himself laughing more than he had in months, drawn in by her quick wit and the way she gestured emphatically when she got excited about a topic. When he finally left, promising to return later that week, Beatrice called after him. Next time, bring your own coffee. You're making the cafe next door rich with all your fancy lattes. Andrew drove home in a daze, his apartment in Kensington feeling even more sterile and empty than usual. That night, while he was supposed to be reviewing a merger proposal, he found himself instead ordering books from Beatrice's shop online, just so he'd have an excuse to pick them up in person. His mother called while he was adding a 3rd book to his cart. Andrew, we need to talk about your behavior at the Kensington Gala. Princess Katerina was deeply offended by your disappearance, and her family is having second thoughts about the arrangement. Good, he said, hitting purchase on the books, because I'm not marrying her. The silence on the other end of the line was arctic. I beg your pardon? I said I'm not marrying her, or Lady Charlotte, or any of the other suitable matches you've lined up. I'm 28 years old, not livestock at auction. Andrew Whitmore, we have sacrificed everything to give you this opportunity. I didn't ask for this opportunity, Andrew said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. And I don't want it. I'm sorry that disappoints you, but I'm not going to marry someone I don't love just so you can have titled grandchildren. He hung up before she could respond, his heart pounding. His phone immediately started ringing again, but he silenced it and returned to Beatrice's online shop, ordering 2 more books just for the defiant pleasure of it. Later, lying in bed and staring at his ceiling, Andrew thought about Beatrice's words. Life's too short to spend it doing something that doesn't set your soul on fire. For the first time in years, Andrew might understand what fire felt like. Over the following weeks, Andrew's life split into 2 distinct realities. There was the world his parents inhabited, charity galas, business dinners, carefully orchestrated encounters with eligible aristocratic daughters. And there was Between the Lines, where he could be Andy, where no one cared about his portfolio or his pedigree, where Beatrice talked to him about Octavia Butler and argued passionately that tea should always be served at exactly 95 degrees Celsius. He should have known his parents would find out. It started subtly. His mother began mentioning property investments in Camden, how the area was improving and ripe for development. His father casually brought up tax advantages of acquiring small retail properties. Andrew, who hadn't become successful by being oblivious, understood immediately what they were really saying. They were going to destroy the bookshop. The confirmation came during a particularly excruciating Sunday dinner at his parents' Mayfair townhouse, where Andrew had been subjected to 3 hours of small talk with Lord and Lady Pemberton and their daughter, the insufferable Lady Charlotte, who had opinions about the proper way to hold a teacup and whether one should summer in Monaco or Portofino. "We've made an offer on a building in Camden," his father announced over dessert. "A charming little property between a tattoo parlor and a vintage shop. The owner is behind on rents, apparently. Should be a simple acquisition." Andrew's blood ran cold. "You can't do that." "Can't do what, darling?" his mother asked innocently. "Invest in property. We've been doing it for decades." "You're targeting Beatrice's shop." The name slipped out before he could stop it, and his mother's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. "Beatrice? Is that the girl you've been sneaking off to see? The one who runs that dusty little bookshop?" "How did you—" Andrew started, then stopped. Of course they'd had him followed. They always did when he started showing too much independence. "We're your parents, Andrew," his father said, his voice taking on that reasonable tone that Andrew had learned to dread. "It's our responsibility to protect you from making catastrophic mistakes. This girl, this Beatrice, she's clearly unsuitable. No family, no connections, barely making enough to keep her shop open. She sees you as a meal ticket." "She doesn't even know who I am," Andrew said, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. "She thinks I'm a struggling consultant named Andy." "How charmingly naive," his mother said, dabbing at her lips with her napkin. "Darling, no one is that oblivious. She knows exactly who you are and what you're worth. This whole act, the bookshop, the intellectual conversations, the girl next door routine, it's designed to appeal to your romantic notions. But we didn't raise you to be fooled by gold diggers, no matter how well read they are." "Beatrice isn't—" Andrew started, but Lady Pemberton cut him off with a sympathetic smile. "Young Andrew, we've all been there. A pretty face, a seemingly authentic personality, the allure of something different. But you must think of your future, your legacy. Women like that are wonderful for a dalliance, but they're not wife material, not for someone of your standing." Andrew stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "My standing? I'm the grandson of a shipping magnate. My great-grandfather worked in a factory. We're not royalty, no matter how much you want to pretend otherwise." "We could be," his mother said coldly. "Princess Katerina's family is willing to overlook our origins in exchange for a substantial settlement. You could have a title, Andrew, real standing in society. All you have to do is stop this foolishness with the bookshop girl and commit to your future." "And if I don't?" His father's expression hardened. "Then we proceed with the property acquisition. The building owner is desperate to sell. We'll buy it, raise the rent to market rates, and your little Beatrice will be out of business within 6 months. Is that really what you want? To impoverish the girl you're so smitten with just to prove a point?" Andrew felt the trap closing around him. If he continued seeing Beatrice, his parents would destroy her business. If he walked away, he'd be condemning himself to exactly the life they wanted for him, the arranged marriage, the title, the slow suffocation of becoming who they demanded he be. "This is blackmail," he said quietly. "This is love," her mother corrected. "We're protecting you from yourself, darling. One day, when you're married to the princess and your children have titles, you'll thank us." Andrew laughed without another word, ignoring Lady Pemberton's bewildered expression and Lord Pemberton's disapproving glare. He sat in his Aston Martin for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to control the rage and helplessness coursing through his veins. Then he made a call. "Marcus," he said when his lawyer answered, "I need you to look into a building in Camden, the one housing Between the Lines bookshop. I want to know who owns it, what their asking price is, and I want to buy it, anonymously, if possible." By morning, Andrew owned the building. By noon, he'd had his lawyer draft a new lease for Beatrice at half her current rent with a 20-year term and protection against sale or development. By evening, he'd set up a trust that would ensure the building could never be sold to his parents or anyone they might use as a proxy. It cost him £4 million. It was worth every penny. But the victory was hollow because he knew the truth. His parents wouldn't stop. They'd find another way to separate him from Beatrice, another pressure point to exploit. Unless he was willing to give up his inheritance entirely, they would always have leverage. That night, he showed up at Between the Lines just before closing. Beatrice was restocking shelves, humming along to whatever indie folk song was playing on the radio. "Andy," she said, her face lighting up in that way that made his chest tight. "You're late. I was starting to think you'd abandon me for a better bookshop." "Never," he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. Beatrice must have heard something in his voice, so her smile faltered. "Are you okay? You look like someone kicked your dog." "I don't have a dog," Andrew said, attempting levity and failing. Metaphorically speaking. She set down her stack of books and moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Andrew wanted to say. "I'm falling in love with you, and my parents are determined to destroy anything that makes me happy. I've spent £4 million to protect your shop, and you don't even know my real name. I'm living a lie every time I walk through your door, and I don't know how to tell you the truth without losing you." "Just a rough day at work," he said instead, the lie sitting like ash in his mouth. Beatrice studied him for a long moment, then took his hand and led him to the back of the shop, where she kept a small electric kettle and a collection of mismatched mugs. She made tea with the focused intensity of someone performing a ritual, and pressed a steaming mug into his hands. "You don't have to tell me what's wrong," she said softly, "but you should know that you can. I'm a very good listener, and I keep excellent secrets." Andrew looked at her, really looked at her, in the warm light of the bookshop. She was wearing a cardigan with a hole in the elbow and jeans that seen better days, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "What if," he said carefully, "the person you thought you were isn't who you actually are?" "Then I'd say you're every person who's ever lived," Beatrice replied. "We're all wearing masks, Andy. Some are just more obvious than others." "And if someone was wearing a really convincing mask, what would you say to them?" Beatrice was quiet for a moment, cradling her own mug. "I'd say that masks are heavy, and eventually you have to take them off or suffocate. And I'd hope that when they did take them off, the people who really mattered would still be there." Andrew wanted to tell her everything then, about the money, the parents, the princess waiting in the wings, but the words stuck in his throat, trapped by fear and the terrible certainty that the truth would change everything. Instead, he said, "I've spent my whole life being told who to be. You're the only person who makes me forget I have to be anyone at all." Beatrice's breath caught, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, something shifted between them. She set down her mug and stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Andy," she said, and his false name had never sounded more real. "Who do you want to be?" "Yours," he said, before he could think better of it. She kissed him then, and the world narrowed to just this, the taste of tea on her lips, the softness of her cardigan beneath his hands, the way she sighed when he pulled her closer. It was nothing like the calculated kisses he'd exchanged with debutantes at society functions, all performance and no passion. This was real, messy, perfect. When they finally broke apart, Beatrice was smiling against his mouth. "Well," she said breathlessly, "that was unexpected." "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" Andrew asked, his heart still racing. Definitely good, she confirmed. Although, fair warning, I'm a terrible girlfriend. I forget birthdays, I talk during movies, and I have very strong opinions on the Oxford comma. I'll risk it, Andrew said, and kissed her again just because he could. He drove home that night feeling like he was flying, his phone full of ignored calls from his mother, and a future that seemed complicated in entirely new ways. He had 4 weeks before his parents made good on their threat to force him to marry the princess. 4 weeks to figure out. For 3 weeks, Andrew lived in a state of careful balance, managing his double life with increasing desperation. By day, he attended his parents' carefully orchestrated events, smiled politely at Princess Katerina's vapid conversation, and let them believe he was coming around to their way of thinking. By night, and every spare moment, he was at Between the Lines, helping Beatrice with inventory, discussing books, stealing kisses in the poetry section. He was also quietly using his resources to protect her in ways she'd never know. When her ancient heating system broke down, he had it replaced anonymously through the building's management company, which he now owned. When she mentioned struggling with online sales, he hired a web developer to overhaul her website, presenting it as a lucky win in a small business contest she didn't remember entering. Every threat his parents made, Andrew countered with his money and his connections, building walls around Beatrice without her knowledge. It couldn't last. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Andrew was helping Beatrice reorganize the classic literature section when the bell above the door chimed. He looked up and felt his blood turn to ice. Princess Katerina stood in the doorway, resplendent in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than every book in the shop combined. Behind her, like a general surveying a battlefield, stood Andrew's mother. "Andy?" Beatrice said, her voice uncertain. "Do you know these people?" "Hello, Andrew," his mother said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "What a charming little shop. Is this where you've been spending all your time?" Beatrice's eyes widened, flicking between Andrew and the two women. "Andrew? I thought you said your name was Andy." "It is," Andrew said desperately, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "Andy is short for Andrew. Oh, how sweet," Princess Katerina said, her accent making every word sound like cut glass. "He's been playing pretend. Andrew, darling, your mother told me about your little hobby, but I didn't believe her until now." "Hobby?" Beatrice repeated, taking a step back from Andrew. Her voice had gone very quiet. "What's going on?" Andrew's mother moved through the shop like a shark through water, her gaze cataloging and dismissing everything she saw. "Miss Beatrice, is it? I'm Victoria Whitmore, Andrew's mother, and this is Princess Katerina of Liechtenstein, Andrew's fiancée." The word hung in the air like a bomb. "Fiancée?" Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "We haven't officially announced it yet," the princess said, moving to Andrew's side and linking her arm through his in a possessive gesture that made his skin crawl. "But yes, Andrew and I are to be married. Our families have been planning it for months." I'm not, Andrew started, but Beatrice was already backing away, her face pale. "I need you all to leave," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Now." "Of course," his mother said smoothly. "We just wanted to see what had been occupying so much of Andrew's attention. I must say it's quite charming, very quaint." The word was a knife, precisely aimed and perfectly delivered. Andrew saw Beatrice flinch as if she'd been struck. "Miss Beatrice," the princess said, and her voice was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "You seem like a nice girl, but surely you must see that this was never going anywhere. Andrew has obligations, responsibilities, a future that was planned long before he wandered into your bookshop." "Get out," Beatrice said again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. "All of you, including you, Andy, or Andrew, or whoever you actually are." "Beatrice, please, let me explain." Andrew reached for her, but she jerked away from his touch. Explain what? That you've been lying to me for weeks? That you let me talk about my struggling business while you probably have more money than this entire neighborhood combined? That you kissed me while you were engaged to someone else? I'm not engaged to her, Andrew said desperately, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. I never agreed to marry her. My parents want me to, but I could never. What you want seems to be entirely besides the point, Beatrice said, and the steadiness in her voice was somehow worse than the tears. You're a Whitmore. I looked you up after you left yesterday because you were acting strange, and oh, was that an enlightening Google search. 200 million pounds, venture capital, society pages showing you at galas with women who look like they stepped out of Vogue, and me, the pathetic little bookshop owner who didn't even recognize one of Britain's most eligible bachelors when he was standing in her shop. That's not fair. None of that matters. What we have is real. What we have is a lie, Beatrice corrected. You built it on lies, and I was stupid enough to believe it. But at least now I know why you were really here. What was it? Slumming with the common people, seeing how the other half lives before you go back to your real life? Andrew, his mother said crisply, we're leaving. You've upset this poor girl enough. No, Andrew said, his voice hard. You're leaving. I'm staying. His mother's expression turned glacial. If you stay, we proceed with our plans. The building sale, the business disruption, all of it. Choose carefully, Andrew. Beatrice's eyes widened. What is she talking about? Nothing, Andrew said quickly, but his mother smiled. Didn't he tell you? Andrew has been quite the knight in shining armor, using his fortune to protect your little shop. The new heating system? Him. The website overhaul? Him. Even the building itself, he bought it just to make sure we couldn't drive you out. Very romantic, really, in a stalkerish, manipulative sort of way. Beatrice looked at Andrew, betrayal written across every feature. Is that true? I was trying to help, Andrew said weakly. You were trying to control my life without my knowledge or consent. You weren't protecting me, Andrew. You were playing God with my business, making decisions that should have been mine to make, all while pretending to be someone you were not. Come along, Andrew, Princess Katerina said, tugging at his arm. Let's leave the poor girl with her books. Andrew shook her off so violently that she stumbled back, her composed expression finally showing a crack of surprise. I'm not going anywhere with you. Then you're choosing poverty over standing, his mother said coldly. Choosing this shop over your family, your future, your name. Is that really what you want? Andrew looked at Beatrice, at the tears streaming down her face, at the betrayal and hurt in her eyes. He thought about his mother's threats, his father's ultimatums, Princess Katerina's cold ambition. He thought about the gilded cage of his life, the expectations that had been crushing him since birth. And then he thought about Beatrice's laugh, the way she talked about books like they were living things, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, at Andy, the person he wanted to be, rather than Andrew, the person he was expected to become. Yes, he said simply, I choose her. I choose this. I choose myself. His mother's face could have frozen fire. Then you choose to be cut off, not just from your trust fund, Andrew, from everything, the company, the investments, the family name, all of it. Keep it, Andrew said, and felt a weight lift off his shoulders. I don't want any of it, not if the price is losing who I actually am. Princess Katerina made a disgusted sound. You're throwing away everything for a bookshop girl? Have you lost your mind? No, Andrew said, looking at Beatrice, even as she wouldn't meet his eyes. I think I'm finding it for the first time. His mother gathered her purse with sharp, angry motions, angry and wounded. You'll regret this, Andrew, when you're struggling to make rent, when you can't afford your precious lifestyle, when reality sets in and you realize that love doesn't pay bills. You'll regret this. Maybe, Andrew acknowledged, but at least I'll regret my own choices instead of living your dreams. They left in a storm of expensive perfume and wounded pride, the door slamming behind them. In the sudden silence, Andrew turned to Beatrice, with hope and fear warring in his chest. "Beatrice," Andrew started, but she held up a hand. "I need you to go, Andrew," she quieted. "I need to process this, all of it, the lies, the money, the manipulation. I need to figure out who you actually are versus who I thought you were, and I need to do that without you standing here looking at me like I'm supposed to fix this." "I love you," Andrew said, the words tumbling out desperate and true. "I know I lied, and I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but everything I felt for you was real, is real. You make me want to be better, Beatrice. You make me want to be the person I see in your eyes." "And who is that person, Andrew?" Beatrice asked, finally meeting his gaze. "Because from where I'm standing, I don't know anymore, and I'm not sure you do either." "Then let me prove it to you," Andrew pleaded. "Let me show you that I'm not my parents' puppet or a trust fund kid playing at being normal. Let me—" "No," Beatrice said firmly. "You need to go, Andrew, right now, and you need to stay gone until you figure out who you are without me, without your parents' expectations, without the money or the lies or any of it. Because I can't be the person who—" 3 days later, Andrew was living in a hotel in Camden. Not the Ritz or the Savoy, but a modest place where the sheets were clean and no one cared who his parents were. He'd spent 72 hours drinking terrible coffee, walking the streets until his feet ached, and trying to figure out who Andrew Whitmore was without the fortune or the expectations. It wasn't easy. Every time he looked at his phone, there were messages from his parents, from lawyers, from Princess Katerina's increasingly irritated family. He ignored them all. He was working up the courage to go back to Between the Lines, not to argue or plead, but simply to apologize and then leave her alone like she'd asked, when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Whitmore," a crisp, aristocratic voice said, "this is Lord Edmund Fitzroy, private secretary to His Majesty. I'm calling on behalf of the royal family regarding your recent change in circumstances." Andrew's blood ran cold. "I don't understand." "Your engagement to Princess Katerina of Liechtenstein was to be part of a larger arrangement between the British and Liechtenstein royal families. Her family is quite displeased by your rejection, and they've made certain demands. Demands that the palace has asked me to convey to you personally." "What kind of demands?" Andrew asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "They want you to reconsider, and they're willing to apply considerable pressure to ensure you do. Political pressure, economic pressure, and, if necessary, personal pressure on those you care about." Andrew thought of Beatrice, of her small bookshop and her defiant independence, of how easily powerful people could destroy vulnerable things. "They're threatening her," he said flatly. "Beatrice." "I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics," Lord Fitzroy said, "but I would advise you to consider the consequences of continued refusal very carefully, Mr. Whitmore. The palace doesn't make these calls lightly." The line went dead. Andrew sat there for a long moment, staring at his phone. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. Not with humor, but with the desperate, slightly unhinged laughter of someone who'd reached the end of their rope and found something unexpected. Because the palace had made a mistake. They'd shown him that this went deeper than his parents' social climbing. They'd revealed that there were forces at play that wouldn't accept no for an answer, that he was more trapped than he'd ever imagined. But they'd also shown him something else, that Beatrice was worth fighting for, that this, whatever this was between them, mattered enough that powerful people wanted to destroy it. And Andrew Whitmore, who had spent his whole life being told what to do, who he should marry, who he should become, decided he was done being told anything. He didn't know how to fight the royal palace. He didn't know how to protect Beatrice from forces that could crush them both. He didn't know who he was without his money or his family name. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd rather be a commoner with her than a king without her. The question was whether she'd still want him after everything he'd done. Only one way to find out. Andrew grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his phone buzzing in his pocket with another call from the palace. He didn't answer. He had a bookshop to get to.